Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, and thank you for giving me again the opportunity to brief the Council today on the situation in Yemen. Today I will argue, Mr. President, on the basis of the facts in front of us, that we have no time to waste before moving forward with purpose and resolve towards the political solution to end the conflict in Yemen. At my last briefing to this Council, I'd made just such a call, and if anything, the facts before us now make this even more compelling. What are the reasons behind this appeal? Mr. President, the first reason is the worrying military escalation. The attack on ARAMCO facilities in Saudi Arabia this past Saturday morning, 14th of September, which has caused significant disruption to the kingdom's crude oil production, has consequences well beyond the region. And I echo, of course, the Secretary General's statement condemning this attack. And at a minimum, this kind of action carries the risk of dragging Yemen into a regional conflagration. Because of one thing we can be certain, and that is that this extremely serious incident makes the chances of a regional conflict that much higher and of a rapprochement that much lower. And with Yemen in some way or other linked, none of that is good for Yemen. And this is frankly terrifying and is an eventuality which runs completely counter to the many and detailed conversations I have had in recent weeks with people in the region, in Yemen and elsewhere, in favor of a series of steps to be taken by the parties towards de-escalation. It's not entirely clear who was behind the attack, but the fact that Ansarallah has claimed responsibility is bad enough. And whatever we will discover of the attack, it is a sure sign that for Yemen, the direction of travel seems to be away from the peace we all seek. And every day that war goes on, the greater the threat, as we see, to regional stability. So we need to take a bold move. Mr. President, it is always and inevitably invidious to choose for attention one event in a war as broad and complex and violent as the one we face in Yemen. But we do so, and I do so on this occasion, to illustrate the horror of the war and thus an appeal to the collective conscience and an emphasis on the terror faced by ordinary people in Yemen on a daily basis. The attack in Damar on the 1st of September led to the deaths of about 110 people and the wounding of 43 more. Only a handful escaped unhurt from that building. I am well aware of the reasons put forward for this attack. My purpose here is not to adjudicate, of course, on that decision, but the attack itself, nevertheless, reminds us so vividly of all that we want to bring to an end. And these actions, the actions I have described, make peace more difficult and indeed even more necessary. Mr. President, the second reason for my appeal is the situation in the south. Events there present to us an eerie calm. The city of Aden remains broadly under the control of the Southern Transitional Council. In neighboring Abiyan, its forces face those of the government of Yemen. In Shabwa, further to the east and the north, a shaky standoff has been achieved. Forces from other fronts have moved to support their respective sides in this new and dangerous crisis. And these moves, in turn, destabilize those other fronts, encouraging new military adventurism. There's really nothing good to be said about this, besides that calm I mentioned. I am, of course, encouraged by the calls for peace from other groups in the southern governorates who do not want events in Aden to be repeated or to spread. Nevertheless, the risk of further fragmentation and of violence and of displacement is real. The status of forces and their rearmament makes even the most optimistic of us cautious in judgment. And I condemn, as I did last month, to this Council the unacceptable efforts by the Southern Transitional Council to take the control of state institutions by force. The functioning of state institution is a necessity and must prevail. In Jeddah, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is intensely focused on mediating a solution. We discussed this at the last meeting of this council on the 20th of August. I wish them every success. They are indeed, as I said then, the indispensable mediator, and they frankly bring real meaning to the phrase that their success will be our success. I welcome the presence of delegations from the government of Yemen, under President Hadi's leadership, and the Southern Transitional Council in Jeddah. And I can imagine and know that this council joins me to wish the Saudis, their leadership, and the two delegations every success in their crucial effort to reduce this threat to Yemen's, frankly, to its existence. As many have said before, the lasting and resounding message from developments in the south is a clarion call for an urgent need to end the conflict in Yemen as a whole. And as President Hadi told me last month, we need to urgently make progress for the war not to expand further. And there is simply no argument, no choice, no better use of our energy now than that endeavour. We see, therefore, the war not merely continuing to wreck the lives and livelihoods of men and women in Yemen, but we also see it threatening to metastasize into something that threatens the existence of Yemen itself. And so we must move, Mr. President, to end it, and end it soon. Mr. President, despite this admittedly very grim picture, we had some limited progress this month. Since my last briefing, the parties have taken further steps towards implementing the Stockholm Agreement. On 8th and 9th of September, the parties held the 6th joint meeting of the Redeployment Coordination Committee in the Red Sea to discuss ceasefire enhancement, disengagement from the front lines, and the implementation of plans for redeployment of forces. The meeting was held in a very positive and a very pragmatic atmosphere, and I'm grateful to the leaderships of the parties who made this so, and their representatives present on that vessel. I'm very pleased to say that the tripartite ceasefire and de-escalation mechanism is now alive and well, and a joint operations centre has already been set up and running for a full week. This mechanism, perhaps overdue, allows for greater communication between the parties, with liaison officers physically present on a 24/7 basis, and with contact with commanders on the ground to prevent military escalation. This tripartite mechanism is, in fact, again, way overdue, the first joint practical initiative since the Stockholm Agreement was made. Practical in the sense of an immediate, visible impact on the way that the parties operate in Hodeidah. Both parties, in fact, asked, I repeat, asked for this mechanism as part of their efforts to shore up the ceasefire. And I'm sure it will help to save lives, and we have already seen a decrease in incidents in Hodeidah city during this past week. I'm encouraged, therefore, by the parties' willingness to implement further measures, including the regular meetings of those liaison officers I have mentioned, and their meetings in specific locations along the front lines in Hodeidah city, as well as the opening of key humanitarian corridors. So the sustained reduction in violence, still somewhat controversial in some minds, but not in ours, has been one of the major achievements of the Hodeidah Agreement so far. I welcome these concrete steps to reinforce it and to improve access for delivery of humanitarian aid. And we must be reminded that this Hodeidah Agreement was and is a humanitarian agreement. These were, are, and shall continue to be the primary goals of that agreement reached in Stockholm last December. On the basis also, Mr. President, of detailed analysis in that last RCC meeting of the issues surrounding the Phase 1 redeployments we have all been waiting to see happen for so many months, and on the basis of a proposal I had tabled to them, the parties now have a revised proposal with them on the basis of the discussions for their urgent consideration to allow those redeployments to take place. We're expecting their response by the 20th of September, and I appeal to the parties to respond positively. So Hodeidah does move forward, slowly perhaps, late certainly, but with purpose. My own hope is that we will continue to manage improvements in the ceasefire and prevent any major attacks in the governorate, and that is the bottom line of that agreement. Meanwhile, the parties have in their hands now the decisions about redeployments. As you have heard, Mr. President, as this council certainly has been involved, but I would like now to congratulate the new head of the UN Hodeidah mission and the new chair of the Redeployment Coordination Committee, my good friend and colleague, Lieutenant General Abhijit Guha. I can think of no one better qualified for this difficult and demanding and important role. I wish him every success in his position, and of course he has my full support. And I would also like to express and reiterate my gratitude to UNMAHA colleagues who continue to work under extremely difficult conditions and who have maintained the level of attention and engagement and pace during the period between the departure of General Lollesgaard and the imminent arrival of General Guha. Mr. President, I don't have much to say today on other elements of the agreements reached in Sweden. I've seen no breakthroughs on prisoner release, a matter made all the more tragic given the deaths in Dammar. My proposal for the release of a first batch of prisoners was welcomed by one party, but not so by the other, which insisted instead that all prisoners everywhere must be released in one go, an interpretation of the all-for-all principle. I'm afraid this is not a practical suggestion. If it was, we certainly would have followed it sometime before this, as both sides are reluctant at different times to avow the identity, existence, and location of prisoners. And indeed, identifying prisoners and their location in the fog of war, not exclusively in Yemen, is a desperately difficult task, which is why I had concluded, perhaps rightly or wrongly, that we should identify and release, and then continue to identify and release, that the first batch of prisoners be followed by other batches until we exhaust the list of all prisoners agreed between the parties. But for now, this is not to be. The complexity of the military situation in Thais, the third element agreed in Sweden in December last year, the military situation there has posed serious challenges to all our efforts, and they have been frequent, to implement the Statement of Understanding, which is the title of that agreement, reached in Stockholm. However, I was encouraged by a recent statement by the excellent Minister of Planning of the government of Yemen. We were together in a meeting in Berlin just a few days ago to still engage and be ready to help the people of Thais as was originally agreed. So we haven't given up. But I want to do this primarily now through support for the local community and for women's groups and local groups that have always been so active on the same issues in Thais and who came together, and I was privileged to meet them in a seminar hosted by the European Union in Amman a few weeks ago. The energy and the creative will and the desire to improve the conditions of families and civilians as represented and exemplified by those groups is a remarkable energy, and I would like to associate myself in support of it. I think they will light the way for the rest of us, and I hope that at a future meeting, Mr. President of this Council, you would allow them to brief us all on the ways and means of how Yemeni civilians see resolving the conflicts that oppress them in this war. Our main goal, their main goal in Thais continues to be the opening of humanitarian corridors to alleviate human suffering and, of course, allow access to humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, I began by saying that the case for an urgent move towards peace has never been more strong, and I hope that these remarks, these various aspects of the situation in Yemen, the war itself, the threat from the south, the as yet unforeseen way in which the ARAMCO attack will take us. I hope all these remarks have made that plain. I know from the daily and detailed discussions that I have with Yemenis, with officials, with youth, with women, and indeed with diplomats of those states anxious to see an end to the conflict. I know from all of these, and they tell me clearly, that they want me to get on with my job. And just as you do, and as you made clear, so clear in your presidential statement, for which I am very grateful indeed, Mr. President. And in parallel, therefore, to the continued efforts, to implement the Stockholm Agreement, and not for forsaking it for a minute, the Yemeni parties must move forward to resume an inclusive political process to reach a comprehensive solution to end the conflict, and that must be done without delay. We must maintain the momentum if we are to preserve the unity and future of Yemen for its people. So I will be continuing and intensifying the engagement I have already begun with a wide range of Yemeni stakeholders in the coming weeks. As part of these efforts, I'm aiming to start informal discussions with different stakeholders, including representatives of political parties, but also public figures, women, youth, civil society. And these discussions, of course, will include the key elements of their views, of the key elements that are needed to be included in a final agreement to be decided, debated, and hopefully agreed between the parties in the near future. Finally, Mr. President, I'd like to make a personal statement. I was present in Sweden when agreements were made, as I think we're all aware. I have a personal reason, therefore, to hold those agreements very dear. Nobody need have the slightest doubt about my desire and our desire in the United Nations to pursue those promises to their conclusion. I'm frequently reminded, for example, that Hodeidah must be implemented before we do other things. And to these people, I say that the United Nations will continue, now under the leadership of Abhijit Guha, to devote time, effort, energy, unparalleled, I think, by others, to achieve that objective. So let us have no doubt about that. And let us have no doubt either that that will not detract from our focus, our essential focus on efforts to reach a political settlement to resolve the conflict in Yemen. Mr. President, thank you very much. I'm sorry I was so long.